You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Charles Rosenberg.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Author Stories. We really appreciate you listening. If you would like to subscribe to the show, over in the right-hand sidebar, there are some handy links where you can click and subscribe on your iPhone or your Google Android device, or listen online, or YouTube, or Stitcher Radio. Pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe to Author Stories there. We would like to thank our sponsors today for sponsoring the show. It's because of their generous support that we're able to bring you so many great author interviews, and we'll be calling out those sponsors throughout the show. So thank you to them. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves. Thank you so much for listening. Now on to our show. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together. And this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle. Available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to talk with Charles Rosenberg about his brand new book, The Trial and Execution of the Traitor George Washington. I've had a copy of this book for a couple of weeks now, and this is one of the I have been more excited about this book than anyone in recent memory. So I'm really excited to talk with you today. Charles, thank you for taking time to come on the show.
You're very welcome. I'm very glad to be here.
Charles, or Chuck, as you introduced yourself when we first began talking, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
You know, the answer to that is I've always wanted to write a novel. And in fact, I started one in the 1970s that I didn't finish. And when I started my first published novel, which was, probably 15 years ago now, my wife said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing a novel." And she said, "Are you going to finish this one?"
Oh, brutal words.
Yeah, well, there are some downsides to long-term relationships.
Yeah, my wife and I are working on our 25th year now, so I can completely commiserate with you there.
Yeah.
So you always wanted to write a novel. Do you trace that desire back to any particular thing, or is it just something that's always burned within you?
I think it's always burned within me, but I think some of it has to do with having just read a huge number of novels as a kid, starting with the Hardy Boys and kind of moving on up from there. So it's just always something I thought, well, geez, this is something I'd really like to do, to write a novel myself. But then it took a long time to get around to it.
Well, there have been a lot of us that cut our teeth on Hardy Boys and then graduated to other things. But I like to ask people what they loved when they were younger, because a lot of times the threads of those things kind of surface in the kinds of stories we like to tell later. Did that love of mystery and kind of the unraveling of mysteries, was that something that compelled you, later on when you began writing this book and the previous books?
It was, but I also liked to read science fiction.
Sure.
And in some ways, mysteries really are science fiction in the sense that you make them up, right?
And a lot of science fiction are mysteries.
Correct. Yeah. So I read a lot of mysteries. I read a lot of science fiction, and then, of course, in school I read a lot of more classic literature that I was quote forced close quote to read, but I didn't feel forced. I enjoyed reading them. Some of the 19th century novels and things like Last of the Mohicans and things like that.
The new book is an alternate history twist on arguably the most famous founding father. And this is a little bit of a departure from what you've done in the past with your other novels. Do you trace this love of early American history, or kind of the founding fathers? Do you trace that back to any particular time or place?
Well, actually, there is one. When I was in fifth grade, our teacher, who was a great teacher, Mrs. Hartlib, got each and every one of us to memorize a long-form poem, and I was assigned The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And, that really got me interested.
What about that story captivated your imagination?
Well, I think, it's got a lot of, I suppose from a novelist's point of view, it has a lot of tension in it. You don't quite know what's going to happen as you get into it. One, if by land, and two, if by sea. And you're worried if Paul Revere or anyone else is going to be captured, that kind of thing. So, it just got me interested as the Revolution as kind of a great story.
So a lot of novelists dream of writing their novel and having lots of people read it and, taking on that hat of novelist. But most of us then go on to pursue other careers and other life paths while we work on that. What was the career path that you chose?
Well, my career path is either eclectic or unfocused, depending on who you talk to. I've been a lawyer all along, mostly in large law firms doing civil litigation and some criminal, but the criminal was federal white-collar defense. But I also, for over a period of 25 years, was the script consultant, the technical consultant to a series of TV shows, including LA Law, The Practice, and Boston Legal. And then I covered the Simpson criminal and civil trials as an on-air commentator for E! Television. And so I've done a lot of things like that, which were sort of a parallel to my legal career, but always involving law in some fashion or other.
I definitely want to ask you about those experiences in just a minute, but what was it that got you fascinated by law? As a kid who loved mysteries and science fiction, was that did the love of the law and the study thereof dovetail with your other interests in your mind?
That's a really good question. I think, I suppose one answer to that is my father really wanted to be a lawyer, but never kind of made it to doing that. He was busy taking care of his family, right, and couldn't afford to go to law school. So maybe I sort of inherited it from that. I don't really know. Never really quite figured out why I wanted to go to law school. I know lots of people have explanations for that, but it's just kind of, I always wanted to go to law school, so I did. And then, I've said to people, because I teach as an adjunct law professor a lot, and students have said to me, well, I'm going to go to law school because I don't know if I want to be a lawyer, but I'm going to go to law school just for the education. And I always say, well, you need to be careful because if you go to law school, you're probably going to end up being a lawyer. So,
it's a pretty good chance of it. Yeah.
Well, you'll have spent all that money,
exactly,
and all that time, and then you'll say, well, I might as well take the bar. I just went to law school. And then all of a sudden you're a licensed lawyer, and what are you going to do? Well, you might as well go get a job. And if you have loans, particularly, you're going to get a job. So, and you'll end up as a lawyer.
Yeah. And people are already going to make the lawyer jokes about you, so you might as well practice.
They are. I developed a client joke.
Oh, that's amazing. I'd love to hear it.
Oh, it's simply, how many clients does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer is, well, who really knows, because they always call their lawyer up to help. Sorry.
I love it. No, that's great. That's fantastic. So how did you get involved with script consulting? That's and when you were rattling those off, I was like, these are some of my favorite, legal thriller TV shows. And I think I read somewhere that you even worked on The Paper Chase.
I did when it was on Showtime, not the movie. Well, it was a pure accident. Back in it was probably 1980, 82, something like that. I was teaching full-time as a law professor at UCLA as a visitor from practice, as they called it. And I got a call one day from the woman Lynn Roth, who was then the executive producer of Paper Chase, which was already on the air. And their consultant had left town or something like that. And they were looking for somebody, and a friend of mine had recommended me. And I think, I said to her, well, why me? And she said, well, you're a law professor and you went to Harvard Law School, and although our show doesn't mention it's set at Harvard, it actually is, to everybody's understanding. And I said, oh, so you're hiring me for local color? And she said, yeah, kind of. And I said, well, I've never read a TV script. And she explained what was needed, and I said, okay. So that was the first of, there's probably been 300 or 400 TV scripts since then.
What does a script consultant do? When they send you the script, do you just go through with your red pen and say, this would never happen? Or, what's that job like?
Well, I think actually it has a couple of different aspects to it. When it's working well, you get to know the writers and you get them to call you up before they write the script and tell you what it is that they're tending to do from a legal point of view. And then I always say, well, what I always tried to do is help writers mine the law for better drama. Because if you don't shove the actual problem under the rug, whatever the legal problem is, and actually try to deal with it, then it usually makes the drama better. And then when the scripts got written, and I should say, by the way, that didn't always work. Sometimes the writers didn't call you and always just went ahead and wrote it anyway. But when the script came through, I would read it and give what people call notes. And sometimes the notes would just say, these are wrong words. It makes it sound like the person didn't go to law school. And sometimes it would be deeper things. I mean, you have to pick your battles. Sometimes I just, make a note, and if they didn't change it, they didn't change it. But if sometimes I thought it was important, and I'd call up and complain, in effect, and lobby to get it changed, I guess is the way I put it.
I worked in the technology industry for decades, and there's nothing worse than picking up a book, and it happens to have a quote-unquote hacker, and just implausible scenarios with horrible lingo, and you roll your eyes and you immediately put the book down because it's horrible, and you just can't abide that. So I would imagine dealing with the law, that would be even worse. So dealing with the writers on the front end, I would imagine, would be much better than trying to shoehorn the proper terminology and all that on the back end. So was there anything in particular that helped you have a better relationship with the writers as you worked with them?
I think the thing that helped you get a better relationship with the writers is being seen as a person who wasn't just calling up to say, you can't do that, that's wrong.
Right.
But a person who would help them figure out how to do it better. So that you would say, what are you trying to accomplish dramatically? And then you would try to come up with something that helped. And also that you understood that it had to fit in the same space, so to speak. It had to have the same number of beats as what you were replacing. So that it helped if you got a reputation of being able to do that. It also depended on who the writer was. So, for example, for L.A. Law in particular, Stephen Bochco, who was the co-creator, fairly early on concluded that it was easier for people who had a law degree to write that particular show. And so there were a lot of people who weren't necessarily practicing lawyers but had law degrees. But there were other very good writers who didn't, who also wrote, excellent scripts. But sometimes it was just different if you were talking to a person with a law degree versus a person without a law degree. And sometimes the people with the law degree were even more difficult than the people without them in terms of what they wanted to do.
Well, they came with preconceived notions a lot of times, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I can tell you my favorite thing, and without naming the show, there was a script I read in which somebody had just been acquitted in a criminal trial by a jury, and the judge says to the prosecutor, "I assume you'll appeal." And the prosecutor says, "Oh, immediately," and it caused me to actually jump out of my chair. And actually called the writer up and said, there aren't a lot of civil liberties left necessarily, but one of them is that if you're acquitted by a jury in a criminal case, it's over for the government. There is no appeal. He said, "Does it have to be that way?" And I said, "Yeah."
That's great.
So that was my favorite or least favorite thing that I remember.
Goodness. How did you get started doing the on-air consultant to these high-profile trials?
During the preliminary hearing in the Simpson trial, I was watching it with my wife, and I said, some of these commentators don't know what they're talking about. And I said, somebody should write a book that just explains to people what are trials really about and how to watch it. Not necessarily the Simpson trial, but any trial. And she said, "Why don't you just do it for once and shut up and do it?" You can see she's played a major role in all my writing.
I think your wife and my wife are actually related.
Probably. So I wrote a little book called The Trial of O.J., How to Watch the Trial and Understand What's Really Going On. And, I got a publisher for it, and it sold fairly well around the country. And then somebody at E bought it and simply called me up and said, "Hey, it looks like you actually know how to explain things. We're going to buy the feed for the Simpson trial. How would you like to come down and be one of our 2 on-air legal analysts?" And I said, "Well, okay." And then I said to my son, because E was new at the time, and he was, 11 or 12. I said, "What's E?" So I spent more or less 2 years on and off doing that. So,
I always like to look at different life experiences and career experiences and see how those things feed the creative process. Do you feel like that time, going in depth, and providing analysis and commentary on these high-profile cases, do you feel like that those experiences heightened your creativity? Do you see that later in life those things have provided fodder for different things, or do you feel like that did not?
Oh, I think it did. There were 2 different aspects to that. With regard to the script consulting, I read hundreds of scripts, many of them written by people like Stephen Bochco and David Kelly, and so I really just intuitively learned to write good dialogue from reading those. And I also got, I think, a better sense of how drama works from reading them. With regard to watching the Simpson trial and other such things, it sort of gave me a real sense of the reality of courtrooms. I've done a fair number of trials myself, but they've been primarily civil trials. And so I think watching the criminal trials sort of gave me a good sense of them.
That first novel that you threatened to write and your wife encouraged you, Death on a High Floor, where did that story come from?
Well, I think, people say that all first novels are autobiographical on some level. And I think that novel is about a lawyer in his early 60s, which is what I was in when I wrote it, who has been at the law firm his whole life. In fact, the opening line is, "I am a lifer." And I left my first law firm after, I think, 12 years or so I wasn't a lifer. But that novel, in some ways, is kind of what I might have been like had I stayed in the same law firm for my entire career. Although I like to think I wouldn't have been as stuffy as Robert, the main character in the novel.
I think you followed that book up with 2 sequels. Is that right?
Yeah, there are 2 sequels. That's right.
Gotcha.
One is set in Paris. The second sequel, just because I wanted to go to Paris and spend some time there. So.
Well, it would seem that those legal thrillers would be a natural progression in your career from all of the things that you had done, that it would make perfect sense to write a legal thriller or a series of those. But now you've got this book about George Washington and this alternate history look. Have you been a fan of alternate history before? And what was the catalyst? I know you've been interested in this your whole life, but what was the catalyst for this particular book?
Well, yeah, I've read a lot of alternate histories, including The Man in the High Castle when it first was published. The impetus for this one in particular was I was simply reading some book, and unfortunately I can't remember what it was, maybe 15 years ago, something about the American Revolution. And it mentioned that there had been a plot in 1776 involving George Washington's own presidential guard, or commander-in-chief guard, to kidnap him that hadn't succeeded, and that somebody was executed as a result. And I remember thinking at the time, that's interesting. Maybe that would make an interesting novel if it did happen. And but then I have a friend who used to say, when somebody'd tell her an elaborate story, and the problem was I couldn't answer the and so question. So he was kidnapped, and so. And then I came upon, much later, another fact that I didn't know, which was that the British had actually tried to settle the American Revolution, that in 1778 they had sent a commission called the Townsend Commission to the colonies to propose what we would call kind of a Canada-like deal. In other words, stay in the empire but make your own taxes and pass your own legislation. And the colonists told them to take a hike because they were about to enter into a treaty with France. And so I thought to myself, well, there's the end. So the British have kidnapped Washington because they want to use him as a bargaining chip to get the colonists, or the Continental Congress, to come seriously to the bargaining table and work out a solution to the American Revolution that ended it early. And so that became the catalyst for the novel, really.
And we know where character of George Washington comes from, but where does the character of Jeremiah Black come from?
I made him up.
Well, tell the listeners a little bit about him and what his role is.
Well, his role is he's basically a special agent of the British who is sent to the New World, to America, to kidnap Washington. And so he's in the mold of special agents, I guess, in lots and lots of novels. He's, somewhat phlegmatic and very focused and good at a variety of sort of military skills. And so he came from, I think, the classic, the classic guy, the can-do military guy sent on a special mission.
What sort of research went into this book? Because in the reading, your world building, if you will, which is a term that mostly gets used for science fiction and fantasy, but when the reader can open the pages and you're immediately in that setting, that's tremendous world building. What kind of research went into it for you to make this so authentic and to immerse me right into the story from the beginning?
Well, I just immersed myself in what life was like in 1780 and 81 in both England and the United States. So I did a lot of reading about it, not just reading about military history or history of the political history of the Revolution, but just history about what it was like what were the roads like, what were houses like, how did people live? And it was kind of amazing because I read a book once called The Past is a Foreign Country, and it's really true. Things like you may remember people during revolutionary times, always men wore those heavy coats. And I wondered to myself, did they take them off when they went inside? Did they drape them over the back of the chair? And the answer is no, they just sweated in them.
Oh my
but
gosh.
Since everybody smelled bad, I guess it didn't matter much. So I just immersed myself in life in the late 18th century, and that helped a lot. And then I also immersed myself in the politics of it all. So I became familiar in some detail with what the arguments were on both sides. And I put that all together and tried to write it.
It's really interesting that we go through these periods in the United States, especially where we romanticize the British Empire. And when we're recording this, there was a British royal wedding the previous weekend, and people went gaga over it, and we so easily forget the conflict of just a couple of centuries ago. Do you in writing this, did you were there any struggles with balancing what the colonists must have felt like then, because they were fighting for their very existence, compared to kind of our very lax attitudes and our friendship, with Britain these days?
Well, I think that what's amazing is when you really tap into the bitterness of the American Revolution on both sides. I think that the history of it is, as taught, is almost a romance. The revolution is romance. But the fact is, for example, the British lost more than 10,000 dead in that revolution, and many, many more in the United States. And so there's a lot of bitterness, and if you want to see that, if you go to the Concord battlefield in Concord, Massachusetts, there's a monument there to British soldiers who were buried there after dying in battle. And it's not very nice. I mean, it basically says, these aren't the exact words, they came around the world to die here, tough bananas. And that was 50 years after the revolution that monument was put in. So it just has taken a long time to get to the point where, there's the special relationship. There was no special relationship at the end of the revolution.
Right. And you talked about the bitterness on both sides. It's really the kind of bitterness that you see in a family torn apart. There were definitely high emotions on both sides.
Yeah, and there absolutely were, and it really didn't end with Yorktown or the Treaty of Paris, because the British went on kind of hassling the Americans, I guess you'd put it,
right,
well into the War of 1812, when, let's face it, they came and burned the White House. Yeah.
Another half century. I think we think of Independence Day when people are listening to the show. Our American Independence Day is in another week or so, and it was not as neat and tidy as we'd like to remember it.
No, and the Battle of Yorktown, in which a major British army was defeated, was in 1781, but the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolution, wasn't signed till 1783. But which reminds me that one of the things that I had the hardest time wrapping my head around as I wrote it was how long it took for everything. There was no instantaneous communication. Even the telegraph hadn't yet been invented. And so if you were sitting in England and something was going on in the United States, in the best of times, it was a 12-week round trip by sailing ship. That was longer coming westbound than eastbound because of the Gulf Stream. But, for example, Lord North, who was the prime minister at the time, Yorktown was in October. He didn't find out about it till December.
George Washington is one of those characters that is almost a fictional character in our minds, because we have lionized him, and he has become a character carved in stone, so to speak. And that when tackling a character like George Washington and a subject like the Revolutionary War, is there ever the fear of tipping over sacred cows and digging into things that we would rather not imagine happening?
I think in some ways it's terrifying to write George Washington.
I'll bet.
Because you worry that you're going to somehow misdepict him, first of all, but you also worry that you're going to depict him in a way that people don't think is accurate, even though it might be. And so you just try to do the best you can. And I think the way I did that, and I assume it's the way most people who depict Washington in fiction do it, is I just read a huge amount about him. Lots of biographies, including a couple of biographies of what he was like as a military leader, and then you just do the best you can.
So in writing a story like this, do you get to imagine what life would be like today if the story would have turned out the way you wrote it?
I think about it sometimes. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, what would it be like if the United States and Britain weren't separate, if they were the same country? But of course, you eventually come up with the idea. Let's see, there are 60 or 70 million or 80 million people in England. It's hard to imagine the United States with 340 million people being a colony of a smaller country. So sooner or later, I assume things would have ended up kind of the way they've ended up with Canada. But yeah, you think about it.
I think, I would like to hope that the spirit of the revolution was bigger than one man. And while obviously the trial and execution of the traitor George Washington would have set the cause back, I like to hope that we would have eventually gotten there.
Well, yeah, and I think it's not as if there weren't other capable military leaders. In fact, when Washington was picked to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, there were other people who wanted that job and who, in effect, applied for it, I suppose we might say. But yeah, by the way, I wanted to tell you about before I forget, one of my favorite research items, which is when I first imagined the novel, I thought, well, Washington, might have been imprisoned in the Tower of London, but would he actually have been imprisoned in the Tower of London? And then I stumbled upon the fact that another American patriot had been captured on the high seas by the British and imprisoned in the Tower of London, and he kept a diary about it, which is published. And I sat on the floor in the stacks at the UCLA Research Library and read his diary about being imprisoned in the Tower of London during the Revolution and what a jerk the jailer was. I thought, wow, this is great.
Love that. In a time where a lot of folks get their news and commentary from comedy shows and late night talk show hosts, when you're writing a piece of alternate history, how do you determine what to keep real, where to fudge and go into fiction, and do you feel any responsibility to the reader to tell them which is which?
I do. I try as best I can to make really 90% of it real. Whereas, so what I've fictionalized is I've fictionalized the character of the British soldier who's sent to kidnap Washington, and I fictionalized the person who's sent by the Americans to try to negotiate Washington's release. Those are the two major fictions. So really it's a couple of characters who are fictionalized, but the politics and the way of life and all of that I tried to make as accurate as I could.
Well, Chuck, the book is absolutely phenomenal. The book is called The Trial and Execution of the Traitor George Washington. I highly recommend this. And for those of you going to the beach on this coming holiday, pick up a copy of it. I think you will be pleasantly surprised. Maybe not even surprised, but I guarantee you'll be enthralled. And you might just learn something out of this book. But I guarantee you'll be entertained. Chuck, where can people find you online if they want to follow along and maybe dig into your back catalog and find out more about you?
Well, there's my website, which is charlesrosenbergauthor.com, and it's got a lot of stuff about me and my other books and this book and my upcoming book.
Excellent. So speaking of that, what are you working on next?
I'm working on another alternate history.
You got bitten by the bug, didn't you?
Yeah, this one's set right before the Civil War, and it's called The Day Lincoln Lost the Election.
Oh, wow. I cannot wait to read that. Is that coming out next year?
Yeah, probably 2019. So.
Excellent. Well, when it does, I'd love to have you back to talk about it.
I'd love to come back, and thanks for having me on your show.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
He led Jason to a small bistro. The door set tiny bells to chime as they entered. The place shivered with smells. Coffee, hot chocolate, and croissants. "This," he said, extending his arm towards a woman in an apron, "is Jennifer. She makes the best scones and is tragically spoken for." He kissed the woman's hand. She was plump, in her 50s. She had left one curler to dangle at the back of her head this morning. "If it's a tragedy to you, this is the first I've heard of it." She swatted at him with a menu. "Why didn't you speak up 20 years ago, lady killer?" Jason sat. Jennifer put a glass of water in front of him. "And who is this fine gentleman?" "This," said Hedwig, joining, "is my son's great-grandfather's great-great-nephew." "That's a lot of greats. Any great-great-great-whatever of Hedwig is great by me." She giggled at her own wit. "I'll be back for your orders." Hedwig swatted her rear end with a menu as she left. He made small talk about the bistro, the specials, what was good, the Benedict, or not so, the hanger steak. When their orders came, coffee for both, eggs for Jason, a scone for himself, he got down to business. "I met your grandmother about, a year ago. Valerie and I have a mutual interest in old families, particularly old families related to the legend for obvious reasons. Valerie's lived in Tarrytown for years, though her family's up near Boston. Now, don't worry. I don't believe all that nonsense about a headless horseman. Valerie's the superstitious one. But the Van Brunts are definitely the family in Irving's story. Hermanus Van Brunt and his wife Agatha were farmers in the village back in 1780 or so. This was during the Revolution. Hermanus grabbed title to lands left by a Tory family who'd been tarred and feathered and shipped back to Britain. Do you know your history?" "Sure. Tory. Loyal to the king. Benjamin Franklin broke with his own son who was a Tory." "Smart boy." "Traitors to the cause. And that was serious business. The British marched straight through here during the war, chased George Washington off Manhattan and out to New Jersey. And after they were kicked out again, a lot of Tories were kicked out with them. Anyway, the Van Brunts took over some farmland north of Tarrytown. They had a son, Abraham. And, of course, their son Abraham married a wealthy heiress. Katrina Van Tassel. Yes, all that is true. It's public record, just like the legend says. My mother left behind quite a few documents written by Abraham Van Brunt, Brom, in Dutch mostly. He was powerful around here. With Katrina's money, he became the biggest stone merchant in the state. He died in 1850. After him, it's Dillon Van Brunt, his son, Joseph, the grandson, then Cornelius, then... Sorry, genealogy is not my thing. No? Why was Eliza doing research on the Van Brunts? She wasn't. She was looking into the Cranes. That's what made us such fast friends. I don't get it. We do go back a ways, your family and mine. More coffee? Jennifer appeared at Jason's elbow. Hedwig nodded, and she poured. Still not getting it, said Jason. But he did. Hedwig turned to the waitress, and Jason knew what he would say. My lady, may I present? He raised his coffee cup, proclaiming, the last descendant of Ichabod Crane.